So that's the 8621. I'm going to quickly do the 8938 and 5471. Both of them are actually quick, even though they're bigger forms. But the 8938, that's like the think of it, I'm sure you've done these before, but it's like an F-bar that's required on your tax return. So you have to include foreign financial assets. The difference between it and the F-bar mainly is that it includes stock in a foreign corporation, whereas the F-bar would not. So sometimes you see this on the K-3. And this is another scenario where it's just like the 8858, where you don't look through a U.S. partnership or S Corp to determine if you have an 8938 requirement. It's only direct ownership. So only time you're really going to have an 8938 requirement as an investor in as when you're getting a K1 is if that partnership itself is a foreign partnership. So you'll never have it with an S Corp. And with a partnership, the partnership, in the partnership scenario, it needs to be, if it's a foreign partnership, then you could have the 8938 requirement. And I should have put the threshold rules in here, and I forgot, but it only applies if your ownership value is over a certain percentage. So again, if you have you go back to where you get the value to come up with the thresholds is you go back to the K1 and look at your capital account balance. That's really the only way, or the easiest way to come up with your value for purposes of the 8938. The 5471. So this is a big topic that could be its own multiple presentations, but basically the Form 5471 is required in certain cases where you have U.S. shareholders of a foreign corporation. We've talked about U.S. shareholders or U.S. partners in a foreign partnership, and that's 8865. Disregarded entity, that's 8858. The PFIC, so a PFIC, these rules override the PFIC. So, even if a foreign corporation meets the PFIC rules, if it's also a controlled foreign corporation, so it's majority owned by U.S. shareholders, then the 5471 trumps the PFIC rules. But this is actually pretty simple for the K3s, I think, at least from a fund perspective. I mean, just like the 8865, I think, it can be a lot more complicated when you're talking about, you have a U.S. operating company that owns foreign subsidiaries in different jurisdictions and they're controlled or majority owned. That has a whole separate bag of issues that's included. But in this case, in the fund's perspective, it's different because it's usually a minority ownership. But I just want to talk through the three scenarios that you can have. So basically, one, if you have a U.S. partner that owns more than 50% in the corporation, so again, we're talking indirectly through a partnership or an S corporation. If the U.S. partner is more than 50%, then they're going to have to file the 5471. It's going to be category 4 and 5, and it's going to be a controlled foreign corporation. And you're going to see this on the K3 because the K3 information, K3 gives the U.S. shareholder of the foreign corporation the information they need to calculate things like GILTI, if you're familiar with that, or Subpart F, and to file the 5471. There are filing on behalf of requirements, which I'm not going to get into, but in this case, if there's control, then you're likely going to have to file this 5471. And then there's people that own in between 10% and 50%. So there's no control, but they also own something that's more than 10%. So they're still considered a U.S. shareholder for foreign corporation purposes. But this is kind of back to the 8865, where their filing requirement is more transactional. So in a year where a shareholder crosses that 10% ownership threshold, then they have to file this form. Or if they go below that 10% ownership threshold, then they have to file the 5471. And that's where you see this a lot of cases in the K3. Is where you're crossing that 10% threshold either on a disposition or an acquisition of shares in a foreign corporation. So that's what you have to look out for. One thing I'm overlooking here, which is important, is attribution and constructive ownership rules. So, even if you own, I guess there's two scenarios. If you own more than 10% of a foreign corporation but less than 50%, you could get kicked back up into this category if there's other U.S. shareholders that own more than 10%, and combined, you get over 50%. With these fund investments, though, you may not have that information or you may not know it, but it's something to look out for. And then there's also attribution rules. If you have family members and things like that that also have ownership, you can be attributed their ownership. So, I mean, that's a bigger topic, but I guess if your ownership is between 10 and 50%, my point is you need to look out for a filing requirement and it'd be category 3. And we'll look at real quick the footnotes that may be applicable. The last scenario is where the U.S. partner owns less than 10% through the partnership or S corporation. So that's honestly the most common scenario in these fund situations. And again, unless there's other family members or something like that you're going to be contributed the ownership of, there's really no U.S. filing requirement. No 5471 filing requirement if you own less than 10% indirectly or constructively of that foreign corporation. And I think that's the main point here, because a lot of times these K3s give you a lot of 5471 information, and you can really rule it out very quickly if you own less than 10% of that foreign corporation, and you don't have any reason to believe that there's constructive ownership with family members and things like that. So real quick, I just want to show a couple of examples. Here's the K1. So I'd go through this scenario. So here they gave us part 5, which just shows distributions from a foreign corporation to a partnership. So just because there is income from a foreign corporation doesn't mean there's a 5471 requirement. This is saying that there's E&P distributed. Again, you can just go back. That's all the information we're given about this foreign corporation. They check the 5471 box. But there's no 5471 requirement because there's no indication that there's ownership that would trigger a 5471 requirement. So this information would just be on the K1. And then the other scenario that I pulled out was 5471's included. They attached the 5471 itself. So in this case, the S corp filer is actually the owner of this foreign corporation, but our shareholder owns less than 10% of that S corp. And there's a lot I could talk about here, but basically, in this case, the S corp had the filing requirement. The U.S. owner could also have a filing requirement if they owned indirectly more than 10% or there's constructive ownership. But in this case, that's not the case here. So there was no filing requirement at the shareholder level in this case, although they attached all kinds of 5471 information. And it's the same situation here. I just showed different examples of how the 5471 information can be provided. But it just says here, if they have an indirect interest in CFCs, there could be a 5471 requirement. But here, if you look at the K1, they own 2% of the partnership. So there's no way they could own more than 10% of the foreign corporation indirectly. So there's no 5471 requirement. All right, that's all I got. I didn't leave much time for questions here, so sorry about that. But if you have any, you can reach out to me directly. Somehow I'll share my email address with you all if we don't already have it.